The birth of the perfect servant, how the system manufactures obedience before you can speak. There's a silence that begins long before we ever learn to speak. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of shaping. A silence where your cries are measured, your instincts redirected, your wildness trimmed down like an overgrown branch in a tidy garden. You don't notice it happening. No child does, because the first lesson isn't taught with words, it's felt. The pressure to fit, the cold withdrawal when you don't, the reward of a smile when you comply, the subtle threat of being left behind when you dare to stray. Before you ever asked, "Who am I?" the world had already answered it for you. You're not born into freedom, you're born into formatting. By the time you begin to speak your first truths, your mind is already rehearsing someone else's script. Good boy, polite girl, sit still, speak when spoken to. And don't question the hands that built the cage. They're called teachers, mentors, protectors. But Machiavelli knew better. He warned us, power doesn't seek virtue, it seeks utility. It doesn't need you to be good, it needs you to be predictable. It doesn't demand love, it demands order. And the most efficient way to maintain control is not through violence, but through internalized obedience. Discipline is worshipped, rebellion is pathologized. Even your resistance is neatly diagnosed, medicated, explained away. What once might have become fire becomes fatigue. What could have been defiance dissolves into anxiety. We are told that rules are here to help us, that institutions are benevolent, that education is our liberation. But Foucault whispered something darker. The institution doesn't free you. It watches you. It shapes you by making you visible. The classroom isn't where you learn. It's where you're trained to behave under observation. It's the prototype of the panopticon. You behave not because you're good, but because you might be watched. And somewhere deep inside, you know this. That's why rest feels like guilt, why stillness feels like failure, why even in solitude you still perform. You run even when no one is chasing. You hustle even when there's no finish line. Because the greatest trick of control is convincing you that the race is noble, even when the finish line is extinction. They didn't just teach you math or grammar or history. They taught you to obey, to chase validation, to fear being still. They built a servant and called it success. But this video, it isn't about breaking rules. It's not about shouting louder or fighting harder. That's the trap. That's the theater. This video is about something more dangerous, more intimate. It's about seeing the factory that prints the rules inside your own mind. It's about the invisible hands that taught you to shape yourself into something acceptable, predictable, marketable. It's about the lie that survival requires surrender, that the system knows best, that the cage was for your own good. You're not here because you failed. You're here because something inside you refuses to forget, refuses to numb, refuses to fully belong to a world that rewards the obedient and forgets the awake. You are not broken. You are beginning to see. And once you see it, truly see it, the system can no longer own you. Not completely, not quietly. The question is not, can you escape? The question is, do you remember who you were before the formatting began? Because that memory, that impulse, that hunger is the part of you they tried to erase. And it is also the part that will lead you home. You weren't born into a race, you were born into a womb. And even there, the world had already begun preparing you for the track. Before you ever made a choice, choices were made for you. What you would wear, what you would eat, how you should behave. But it wasn't control through force, it was control through love, approval, smiles, stars on your paper. That's how the shaping begins. Not with brutality, but with rewards. Not with punishment, but with praise. You weren't taught to think. You were trained to please, and it goes deeper than rules. It's the subtle wiring of the nervous system. You learned to flinch at disapproval, to shrink in the face of chaos. You learned that safety comes not from truth, but from conformity. That to belong, you must edit yourself, dim your edges, soften your fire. You were rewarded not for who you were, but for how well you mirrored expectations, not when you were brave, but when you were agreeable. And so your first real enemy was not failure, it was deviation. The child who questions too much, fidgets too much, dreams too wildly becomes the problem to be fixed. Not the sign of potential, but the threat to order. Rebellion isn't met with curiosity, it's met with correction. And the moment you realize that love is conditional, you start to wear a mask. A mask that earns you peace. A mask that earns you permission. But behind that mask, something sacred begins to ache. Something unspeakable, something raw, because your spirit wasn't designed to comply, it was designed to create. That's why procrastination feels like a crime. That's why rest feels like betrayal. That's why you're haunted by a silent question. What if I'm not enough? But here's the truth, most people never say out loud. What you mistake as laziness or lack of discipline is often your soul rejecting a script it never agreed to. You're not avoiding life. You're avoiding the performance, the pretend, the exhausting ritual of becoming what others find acceptable. This isn't productivity, it's programmed identity collapse. You were never meant to live in constant motion, chasing deadlines that were never yours. You were meant to pause, to feel, to choose. But in a world built on efficiency, slowness is punished, reflection is pathologized, stillness is misdiagnosed as failure. So you keep running, not because you want to win, but because you don't know how to stop without falling apart. What if the problem isn't that you're off track, but that you were forced onto the wrong one? What if the race itself is the lie? You sat at a desk before you understood what it meant to sit still. You raised your hand to speak, not because you lacked voice, but because you learned to wait for permission. The classroom wasn't a sanctuary of learning. It was a rehearsal for obedience, neatly arranged chairs, bells like factory whistles, a schedule that chopped your day into digestible chunks of control. You weren't just being educated, you were being formatted. The system wasn't designed to awaken you, it was built to contain you. School became the soft beginning of the leash, not tight enough to strangle, just firm enough to guide. And every time you asked, why? The answer echoed like a verdict, because that's the rule. You weren't taught to seek meaning. You were taught to absorb it, pass the test, follow the protocol, get the grade, stay in line. But this wasn't failure. This was design. The architecture of education mirrors the architecture of compliance. It mimics the factory, the office, the military, uniforms, attendance, surveillance. This was never about curiosity. It was about consistency, about making sure the parts fit the machine, about preparing you to be productive, not powerful, predictable, not original, quiet, not sovereign. Machiavelli understood it with brutal clarity. If you want to maintain control over a population, don't wait for rebellion. Preempt it. Fragment the will before it matures. Redirect hunger into habit. Make docility seem virtuous. Let them believe they're choosing when you've already limited every option. The collar doesn't need to be visible. Once internalized, it becomes the mind's architecture. You no longer resist. You self-regulate. You become your own enforcer. And it works. You grow older, but the leash doesn't break. It evolves. It becomes ambition, productivity, hustle. You speak of dreams, but the script remains. Excel, succeed, conform. Not because you were forced, but because you were conditioned. Conditioned to equate effort with worth, to chase gold stars long after the classroom vanished, to fear freedom because it lacks structure, to fear your own mind because it was never invited to lead. This is not the failure of education. It is its triumph as a tool of the system. It doesn't just shape what you know, it shapes how you live. It doesn't just breed knowledge, it breeds obedience. The most effective form of control isn't physical, it's psychological. You don't outgrow the leash, you internalize it. And that is how the system wins, not by force, but by design. You wake up and feel behind. Even before you check the time, there's already a weight on your chest, a whisper that says you haven't done enough. You think it's your ambition speaking, your drive, your discipline. But what if it's not? What if the voice pushing you to keep moving isn't yours at all? What if what you call motivation is actually surveillance? This is the brilliance of the system. It doesn't need guards when you become your own warden. It doesn't need chains when you carry the prison inside your nervous system. You think you're free because no one is shouting at you. But the silence itself is a trick, because now you police yourself. You monitor your worth by the number of tasks completed, by the notifications replied to, by how exhausted you feel by the end of the day. And when you rest, you don't rest. You tremble. You spiral. You guilt yourself back into motion. Not because rest is wrong, but because you were taught that stillness equals weakness. You were conditioned to see productivity as proof of value, to associate burnout with importance, to measure your soul against your schedule. You weren't taught to be. You were taught to produce, and now even solitude feels like slacking, but the truth is unbearable at first. Most of your hustle isn't born of passion. It's born of programming. You're not self-motivated. You're self-surveilled. You inherited a ghost, the echo of a system that rewards performance, not purpose, that praises the obedient executor, not the conscious creator. You internalized the boss, the grade, the audience, and now you live with them. In your head, in your spine, in your breath. Foucault hinted at this with surgical precision. Surveillance doesn't just watch you, it changes you. You become predictable not because someone told you to, but because you fear what happens when you stop being useful. And so you overwork, you overthink, you overcompensate. All in the name of being seen as worthy, as necessary, as safe. But here's what no one wants to admit. Most burnout doesn't come from doing too much. It comes from never doing what's truly yours. The exhaustion isn't physical, it's existential. It's the toll of betrayal, the betrayal of your deeper self, the self that longs for creation, not consumption, for silence, not performance, for sovereignty, not survival. You keep hustling, hoping the finish line will offer peace. But the line keeps moving, the goal keeps shifting. The applause fades faster each time, and still you run. Because the system doesn't just want your labor, it wants your loyalty, your identity, your allegiance to the grind. But the more you chase, the more you forget. The more you forget, the more you obey. Until one day, you mistake the treadmill for progress. And your soul, forgotten and buried beneath layers of obligation, stops knocking, stops screaming, just waits for you to remember that hustle was never the point. It was the collar you mistook for purpose. You were told the world is fair, that if you just play by the rules, everything will make sense, that goodness guarantees safety, that effort equals reward. And you believed it, not because you were naive, but because the alternative was too bleak. Because questioning the rules meant questioning everything you'd built your identity on. So you worked hard, you were polite, you sacrificed, and you waited for the promised return. But the return never came, or when it did, it was crumbs. Promotions that drained you, praise that vanished with the next deadline, relationships where loyalty became a leash. Somewhere along the way, a quiet truth began to crawl under your skin. The system isn't fair. It never was. It was never designed to be. Fairness was a story, one crafted to keep you obedient, to make suffering noble, to make exploitation feel like moral duty. If I follow the rules, I'll be respected. That's the mantra they fed you. But respect in a rigged game isn't respect, it's manipulation. The truth is harder to swallow. Power doesn't reward virtue. It rewards usefulness. It rewards silence. And when your usefulness runs dry, so does your value, not because you changed, but because the system never saw you as whole. It saw you as a function. Machiavelli never romanticized loyalty. He dissected it. He understood that loyalty without leverage is weakness, that to give yourself entirely to a system that does not reciprocate is not honorable. It's suicidal. And yet that's what we're trained to do. Be the good worker, the reliable partner, the selfless citizen, all while our time is extracted, our energy consumed, our uniqueness dulled down to fit the mold. To be moral in a broken game is not righteousness. It's submission. It's wearing integrity like armor, hoping it will shield you from a system designed to pierce through it. And when it does, when your devotion isn't enough, when your obedience doesn't save you, you blame yourself. You think you weren't good enough, when the truth is, you were never meant to win. You were meant to keep trying, because your effort fuels a machine that feeds on belief that the game is winnable. But it isn't. Not on their terms. Not when the rules are built to serve the architects, not the players. You weren't designed to thrive. You were designed to function. And the more you believe in fairness, the deeper the betrayal cuts when reality hits. You begin to see that the game doesn't reward those who play it right. It rewards those who rewrite it. Yet you still hesitate. Because the idea of not playing feels like treason, like failure, like chaos. But maybe, just maybe, that chaos is the beginning of clarity. Maybe the moment you stop trying to be good is the moment you finally become free. You think you know what you want. You think your goals are yours, carefully chosen, rationally pursued. But beneath the surface, something ancient is at play. Not logic, not preference, mimicry. You saw someone else want it first, and that's what made it shine. The house, the title, the lifestyle. You didn't desire it until you saw it desired, and suddenly it became yours, or so you thought. René Girard called it mimetic desire, the engine of imitation that governs more than we dare admit. You want what others want, not because it suits your soul, but because their desire makes it look valuable. The goal becomes a symbol, not of fulfillment, but of worth, belonging, status, safety. And so you enter the race, not for survival, but for validation, not for truth, but for mirrors, because to chase what is truly yours would mean standing alone, and that terrifies you. The world thrives on this trap. Entire industries are built not to meet your needs, but to create them. They don't sell you happiness. They sell you envy. They sell you identities shaped by trends, not truths. And you buy them. Not because you're weak, but because you were never taught to distinguish hunger from habit. You confuse longing with lack. You mistake imitation for inspiration. And before you know it, you're sprinting toward a life you never questioned. But imitation has a cost. It breeds anxiety, restlessness, scarcity, because if everyone wants the same thing, then everyone becomes your rival. Mimetic desire doesn't just create goals, it creates enemies. Competition, pressure. It becomes a war disguised as ambition. And no matter how much you achieve, the hunger never stops, because it was never your hunger to begin with. You're feeding a ghost, running toward an illusion, chasing a prize that loses meaning the moment you hold it. You think you're climbing a ladder, but the ladder is a cage, a perfectly crafted illusion of progress. It keeps you moving but never arriving, keeps you consuming but never satisfied. Because in a system built on mimicry, your authenticity is a threat. Your stillness is rebellion. Your sovereignty is heresy. They don't fear your failure. They fear your refusal to imitate. And so the deepest poverty is not financial, it's existential. It's the poverty of self, when you've spent your entire life becoming someone else's idea of successful. when your identity is an echo and your desires are second-hand. That is the slow erosion of soul that mimetic desire creates, a quiet crisis behind the curated life. But once you see it, truly see it, the illusion cracks. You begin to hear your own voice again, faint, fragile, but real. And in that voice is the one thing the system cannot sell, cannot steal, cannot replicate: you. There is a moment, subtle, irreversible, when a person stops seeking validation and begins seeking vision. Not the vision handed down by institutions, families, or mentors, but a vision that rises from within, raw and unapproved. That moment is dangerous because it threatens everything the system has spent years cultivating. That moment is what they fear most, not rebellion, but sovereignty. To disobey is expected, to disidentify is not. That's what makes it forbidden, because rebellion can be managed, redirected, punished, but disidentification, that's pure anarchy of the self. It means withdrawing your energy, your belief, your participation, not with rage, but with precision, with clarity, with quiet conviction that the game no longer deserves your presence. This isn't about escape. It's not about burning down the system. That's a fantasy they feed you, the image of the loud revolutionary, fists clenched, screaming into the void. But real liberation isn't loud, it's surgical. It cuts deep and in silence. It's the decision to no longer exist on terms that demand your self-erasure. It's not about being seen, it's about seeing, with brutal honesty, seeing how much of your identity was borrowed, built, or beaten into place, and then letting it go. To choose sovereignty is to stand in a kind of silence most can't tolerate. The silence of not performing, the stillness of not proving, the emptiness that remains when imitation falls away. At first it feels like death, the death of the self you were trained to maintain, but beneath that death there's something else, something alive, untamed, waiting. Machiavelli, misunderstood by many, spoke of this in his own way. The wise man does not scream his defiance. He pretends to obey while carving a secret path. A path outside the algorithm, outside the gaze, outside the lie. Because power isn't always about domination. Sometimes it's about disappearance. Not to hide, but to become untouchable. Not to escape, but to move beyond reach. And the hardest part? Killing the craving. That deep, aching need to be acknowledged by the very system that discarded you. Sovereignty demands you burn that need. Watch it turn to ash without flinching, because as long as you seek recognition from the cage, you remain inside it. The key is not found in rebellion. The key is found in refusal, in remembrance, in the silent, sacred act of walking away. Not because you're defeated, but because you finally remember who you were before they taught you to forget. There is no glory in escape if the mind remains chained. No freedom in distance if the destination still bows to the old architecture. That's why the point was never to run faster. It was to stop running altogether, not out of surrender, but out of lucidity. Real rebellion doesn't look like fire. It looks like clarity. It's not loud, dramatic, or cinematic. It's slow, quiet, internal. The moment you see the game and simply stop playing, because you finally understand the race was never yours. The track was carved for someone else's profit. The finish line was a mirage, the applause, a bribe, and the identity you wore along the way. A costume tailored to keep you small enough to manage, but big enough to function. That's what you're shedding now, not because you're angry, but because you're done. You don't need to destroy the system. That was the illusion, that power only comes through battle, but some forms of power are not explosive, they are gravitational. The power to create a new orbit, a new inner axis, a new law that answers only to the truth within. That is authorship, That is sovereignty, and it begins not with revolt, but with a simple, irreversible shift, removing your psychological anchor from a system that never had your soul in mind. Machiavelli, often reduced to cold strategy, understood something deeper. That power belongs not to the loud, but to the lucid, not to those who scream their defiance, but to those who stop needing to be seen at all. Because true control is not the ability to dominate others. It's the refusal to be dominated by illusions, the illusion of safety, the illusion of worth through suffering, the illusion that obedience earns dignity. And so you vanish, not to hide, but to reappear on your own terms, in your own time. You were never lazy, you were never broken, you were never lost, you were resisting, silently, a world that wanted your function more than your essence, a system that feared your questions more than your failures. And now you remember. The free mind doesn't ask for permission, it doesn't rebel to impress, it doesn't wait to be chosen. It builds new gravity, it writes its own map, and in that map the race doesn't exist. Only the path, quiet, unshakable, unseen until it's followed.